Hi everybody. So in this lecture, we are going to be doing some practice with synthesizing and also looking at causal arguments. And we're going to be working with these three sources here. So depending on which class you're in, you may or may not have read those or currently be reading them. If not, that's fine. If your class isn't using these, but you're using other sources, you can still totally apply what we're doing here to whichever sources you are working with. So just a couple of quick tips about synthesis and causal arguments in general. Synthesis is, remember, different than summary. So our goal here is to make some connections between texts and sort of put them in conversation with one another. And remember that when you're synthesizing or you're talking about different texts in this way, you should be using evidence from those texts themselves to go ahead and help your readers see those connections and see what you're talking about. Similarly, with causal arguments, we are also looking at relationships, but in this case, a causal argument is typically going to be looking at a relationship between causes and effects. And remember that it is more complex than just, this thing happens and it causes this effect. Often we have lots of different contributing factors that lead to lots of different effects, right? So keep that in mind. They're often part of other arguments as well. And again, we look at what causes things to happen, and then we might examine that from various points of views. So you can see sort of a relationship here between causal arguments and synthesis, right? Because in our case, again, depending on your class, the sources might be different, but you're probably looking at what different people have to say about what causes a particular thing to happen, right? And in order to look at these different sort of takes on whatever issues we're looking at, we're going to use synthesis to kind of make sense of all of these competing views. So remember that when we do synthesis, we are looking at sources sort of in this way, right? So we'll have lots of different sources, and you might see that maybe source A, B, and C have a little bit in common. Source B and source D might have something in common, and then maybe there's source E that just disagrees with all of them, but maybe it has to do with the same subject matter or something like that. So not all of your sources will agree or disagree. They're going to have some complex relationships between the sources themselves. So when you synthesize, what you should do first is to read and annotate each source carefully. You want to pay attention to the overall arguments that are presented in that source and really have a good understanding of what those authors have to say about that particular topic. Then you should start drawing connections between the sources. So that's where you can have, an idea map or something like that to help you sort of see how these sources interact. Then you're going to write about those connections, and don't forget to include evidence from all of the sources involved. So again, remember that causal arguments look at what causes lead to particular outcomes. This is an example, and I realize now that it's a little bit blurry, but this is a sample where we're talking about the American Revolution, all sorts of things that contributed to, stirring things up at that time, leading to a revolution, some really big ticket things that caused it, and then here we have the actual event itself, followed by several different effects. So again, you can see this sort of complicated relationship between causes and effects in all different aspects, right? It doesn't just have to be with one particular topic. Some practice with annotating. Remember that you should choose an annotation system that works for you. In different lectures, I have presented several different annotation guides. This one is pretty similar to what I tend to do when I am annotating. So if I'm writing or using symbols on a computer or something like that, I might, put an exclamation next to something that I'm like, oh, I'm definitely going to use this to talk about something. If it's a keyword or a key detail, I might underline it. Main ideas might get like a star if it's something really major, like a thesis statement or something. If I have a question, I'll often use a question mark, or different symbols to mean different things. So find one that works for you, or if you don't find one that's kind of pre-made that works for you, just make up your own, and that works too. So when you're annotating, have a system that you use. Try different ones, until you find one that you like, and then mark up your text accordingly. So you should annotate every text that we ever read in our class. And then keep track of quotes that you want to use for upcoming assignments. So things like discussion board posts, quizzes and exams sometimes have essay questions, your essay. You always want to make sure that you're kind of putting a check or a star or something next to some evidence that you can use later on. That way, when you come back to something that you haven't read in a few days, you have places to go to help you pull information from. And then, of course, use them, right? Use your annotations when you're planning for and completing your work. That's the whole goal, is so that you will have a place to go back and grab some information quickly when you need to write something down for an assignment. So I've got some examples for you of annotating a few of the articles that we have read for some of the classes that I teach. So in this case, we're annotating post-princess models of gender. And it's really light, but you can see that I highlighted a really key section of the text here where it says that Pixar consistently, sorry, I cut off some of that. So this up here says, Pixar consistently promotes a new model of masculinity, one that matures into acceptance of its more traditionally feminine aspects. So when I was reading that, I made myself a note here that said this is the key to their argument. New ideas about how to be masculine are more inclusive and better examples for children to emulate, according to the authors. So I would do this kind of thing for the whole article as I'm reading, right? And of course, because I've read it many times, I'm able to see this quote, which actually comes from the beginning of the article, and know that this is when they're really laying out the key, backbone of their argument, which is this, right? So you would do that throughout the whole article, kind of grabbing things that draw your attention or that you think you can use, and so on. And this just happens to be one of the ways that I've annotated. I've also pulled a couple of quotes that I would annotate, on paper. I typically like to print things out and mark them up by hand. So to make that work for this purpose, I've just pulled the quotes for you. So we've got two different quotes from the Real Life Ken and Barbie, another article. And this one says that Pixie Fox has had 17 operations in a bid to become a real life Barbie doll. And then we've got the other focus of that article, Justin Jedlicka, who has had more than 340 cosmetic procedures, and his goal is to become a real life Ken doll. So I've got my sort of notes here that I would write in the margins. So both of these quotes from the Real Life Ken and Barbie article seem to support the claims of Gillum and Wooden, and Gillum and Wooden are the authors of this article. So these ones seem to support those claims, right? Since people were apparently so influenced by pop culture that they're having surgeries to look like Barbie and Ken dolls. Of course, it's much more complex than that, right? And you can't say, well, the existence of Barbie and Ken dolls is why these people have done this. But we can say that it seems to overlap, that if they are publicly saying that their goal is to look like these, dolls, then we can, read something into that and say, well, where does that come from? And what kinds of influences does, do different popular culture figures like Ken dolls and Barbie dolls have on us if we have these two extreme examples, right? It's definitely something to consider when we're having that conversation. So that's just a note that I would leave to myself. And again, I would continue annotating the rest of the article to keep making those kinds of connections. And the final article that we're annotating for this example here in the PowerPoint is another article about the same sort of phenomenon, right? And in this one, it's little girls or little women. So I've got a couple of quotes that I pulled there just to give you an example of, how I would interact with this text. So we have this first one. She came to believe that the $4 billion Disney princess empire was the first step down a path to scarier challenges, from self-objectification to cyberbullying to unhealthy body images. And so that's what this person, who's one of the focuses of this particular article, had to say about the effect that Disney princesses had on her daughter. And then the author of the article, who's different than this person, right? It's important to know who is the author and who they're talking to and those kinds of things. So this author, Stephanie Haynes, notes that this person's theory about Disney princesses is by no means universal. Many parents and commentators defend Happily Ever After against what some critics call a rising feminist attack, and credit the comely ladies with teaching values such as kindness, reading, love of animals, and perseverance. So the author of the article reports on how this mother sees the problem, right? So she tells us that this person sees a problem and that lots of other people do as well. But she also mentions that this is not universal, right? Not everybody agrees about this. So in this article, we might say she acknowledges the problems that some people see, but she also mentions that, not everybody agrees, that it's kind of complicated, and maybe these things also teach children some good things along with the supposedly bad. So now that I've annotated, and again, we want to annotate the whole article, I'm just showing you little snippets. But now that I've annotated and read those articles and kind of made my own notes about it, now I need to start trying to make connections. So remember to draw connections between the text as you annotate and when you're done. And you want to look at things like, how do they overlap? If the authors were in a room together, what might they say to one another about this topic? And then use your writing to make and explain those connections. So I can't emphasize this enough that with synthesis, it is so important to explain the connections that you see. Because if you just give your readers a quote from each of the different articles and assume that we'll know those connections, we won't, right? Because everybody sees it differently. So it's very important that you do use your own writing to not only say this article connects to this one, but also to explain that connection, kind of walk me through what's going on. So this is just one example of how you could do that, and I shortened the titles because fitting them into these little bubbles was a challenge. So we might say that the little girls article, Disney princesses and lots of other pop culture contribute to lots of different problems, is one of the key points in that particular article. So I might list that one here. And then how does it overlap with these other ones? Well, post-princess models of gender would say that old characters were problematic, but that they're getting better, right? We're showing our kids better examples in these newer Pixar movies. So it addresses those problems and says, look, Pixar's fixing that. And then in the real life Ken and Barbie, you can say these people can be seen as an example of what happens when ideas from pop culture influence us too much. So, the real life Ken and Barbie kind of lends acceptance or evidence to both of these, right? Because it would say that, yeah, these can be problematic if we don't have the right examples or if we take them too seriously. And same here, it says that, Disney princesses, just like Barbies, can be problematic, again, if we take them too seriously or if we have, the right set of circumstances where maybe they influence us a bit too much. So drawing connections like that, except with more than one example, right? You would want to make much more extensive lists than this. But that's one of the goals. All right, so quick recap of synthesis and causal arguments. Remember that you need to read and annotate each article first. And while you're doing that, your main goal is to make connections, to see where they overlap, in what ways they support one another, and how and where they disagree. And then use evidence. We want to use evidence from all of the sources that we're using for whichever assignment you're working on. So look at the assignment, see, how many sources do I need to use? Which sources can I pull from? And that's how you know which ones to annotate and how to kind of talk about those connections. And then again, in your assignment, that's where you're talking about those things and explaining what you see to your readers. Again, just like with anything else, if you're getting stuck and you need extra help, reach out to me. I'm happy to have a meeting with you on Zoom. We also have tutoring available, and you're in those groups. So remember to reach out to your groups, work together, go to tutoring. You get extra credit for those last two. And then you can also always come and talk to me if you're having a hard time. So that is synthesis.